The interstate system is known for being extremely extensive, stretching all around the United States, reaching every major city in the country. Now, to do this, it requires some very long cross-country routes, going multiple thousand miles across the country. So today we're talking about those. Before the video starts, though, I wanted to quickly ask if you would please consider subscribing to the channel. I make geography content like this every single week, and December is going to be a pretty exciting month for the videos on the channel. So just click the subscribe button, please, because it helps me out a lot. Thank you. So let's start by talking about the longest three-digit interstates, and then getting into the real longest interstates. First, we have I-287, which stretches across the New York City metropolitan area as a sort of half beltway. It stands at 98 miles from start to finish, serving cities like Edison, Somerville, White Plains, and Port Chester. It's known to be a pretty good bypass of New York City to avoid traffic, only reaching the very outer suburban belt. Next, we have I-495 in Massachusetts, one of just two spur routes over 100 miles in the country, all the way up at 121 miles. This is another sort of half beltway, stretching all the way across the extended Boston area. You start down at the mouth of Cape Cod, and then go right in between Worcester and Framingham, then up to Lowell and Lawrence in the north, and finally the Amesbury-Newburyport area where it terminates. Finally, we have the longest spur route in the country, I-476 in Pennsylvania, which stretches 129 miles from Philadelphia all the way up to Scranton, stretching all through the eastern portion of the state, going through the Poconos as well as the Lehigh Valley area on its way up. This seems to be a pretty important route to the area, being the only direct connection between the three metros. So there's our three-digit routes, which go anywhere from half a mile to 130 miles, which I think is pretty interesting. But now it's time to get to the main event, our major cross-country two-digit interstates. So let's start with our number 10 and work our way from there. The number 10 on the list is going to be I-20 at 1,539 miles. It stretches through the south as a sort of north segment to the longer I-10. First, we start in rural western Texas, where it disconnects from I-10. It then reaches the central Texan cities of Midland, Odessa, Abilene, and finally into Dallas-Fort Worth. From there, it goes into northern Louisiana, reaching Shreveport and Monroe, before it goes into Mississippi and reaches Vicksburg, Jackson, and Meridian. Then into Alabama and Georgia, it passes through their major cities with Tuscaloosa, Birmingham, Atlanta, and Augusta. Then finally into South Carolina, where it goes through Columbia and ends in Florence at I-95. Next up, we have I-35 at 1,568 miles. This is our first north-south route on the list, which we see a lot less because obviously the country isn't square, so there's a lot more room going east-west than north-south. So I-35 starts in Laredo at the Mexican border, then working its way north through San Antonio, Austin, and on to Dallas-Fort Worth. Now, it technically goes through both Dallas and Fort Worth, disconnecting into 35 East and 35 West, since neither city wanted to be bypassed. After Dallas, it goes through Oklahoma City and Wichita, where it then takes an eastern turn towards Kansas City, where it runs slightly diagonally for the rest of the route. Now that it's in the Great Plains and Midwest, there's a lot of farmland, but it does go through Des Moines and the Twin Cities, then ending in Duluth. Next, we have I-94, the only road on our list that isn't a multiple of 5, interestingly enough. So it stretches 1,585 miles through the northern Midwest and Great Plains. Starting in Billings, it basically serves as the I-90 to North Dakota, passing through Bismarck and Fargo, before going south through the Twin Cities into Wisconsin. Then going past Madison and Milwaukee, before immediately turning south to avoid the massive lake in its way. After the lake, it goes back north through Michigan with Kalamazoo and Battle Creek, before ending in Detroit. Next up, we have I-75 at 1,786 miles, another north-south route. This one starts in Miami, Florida, going through the Everglades and being known as Alligator Alley. It then goes up the Gulf Coast of Florida through Naples, Fort Myers, Port Charlotte, Bradenton, Tampa, Ocala, and Gainesville, before reaching the Georgia border, which is a reminder that Florida has way too many people. So next it goes through central Georgia, going through Macon and Atlanta before staying north to Chattanooga and Knoxville. After that, it goes through Lexington and Cincinnati, then into western Ohio up to Toledo and then into Detroit. Then instead of ending in Detroit, it continues north through Flint and Saginaw, then into the Upper Peninsula, where it finally ends at Sault Ste. Marie. Next we have the iconic I-95, probably the most widely known interstate in the entire system, at 1,919 miles. This one also starts in Miami, but goes up the Atlantic coast instead of the Gulf Coast with I-75. So I think you now understand the sheer amount of cities in Florida, so I won't go through them until Jacksonville, which is an actual major metropolitan area. After that, it goes through Georgia and the Carolinas, where it hits Savannah, Florence, and Fayetteville, before getting into the more populated north, with Richmond into Washington, D.C. Once it's into the northeast megalopolis, It basically is a constant city for hundreds of miles, with Baltimore, Wilmington, Philadelphia, Trenton, Newark, New York City, New Haven, Providence, and finally Boston. From there, it gets a lot more rural, though it hits Portland and Augusta and Maine, but mostly it just feels like rural forests before finally ending at the Canadian border. Next up, we have the really fun I-70, probably my favorite cross-country route at 2,150 miles. It starts in Baltimore, stretching west through the Appalachians into the Pittsburgh area, then into Ohio with Columbus and Dayton. Staying in the Midwest, it goes through Indianapolis into St. Louis. It then goes through the central part of Missouri into Kansas City, Topeka, and the western part of Kansas. Once it gets into Colorado, things get interesting, with Denver and finally the Grand Army of the Republic Highway through the Rockies, probably the most beautiful part of the entire system. It then hits Grand Junction into Utah, where it finally goes through some Red Rock country before ending at I-15. Next up, we have I-10, where we really get into the major coast-to-coast routes at 2,460 miles. This one starts right at the Santa Monica Pier in the Los Angeles area. It then goes through the Mojave Desert through Phoenix and Tucson, then into New Mexico with Las Cruces and El Paso. After El Paso, it goes through rural western Texas before finally reaching San Antonio and Houston before getting into the Gulf Coast region. Following the coast and going through Beaumont, Lake Charles, Lafayette, Baton Rouge, New Orleans, Biloxi, Mobile, Pensacola, Tallahassee, and finally Jacksonville, where it ends. Next, we have our number 3 with I-40 at 2,556 miles. This one starts in Barstow, California, where it then stretches east through the desert into Flagstaff and the rest of Arizona. In New Mexico, it goes through Albuquerque, then into Texas with Amarillo. After that, it gets into the more culturally south region with Oklahoma City, Fort Smith, and then Little Rock. Then it goes through Tennessee with Memphis and Nashville, then into Knoxville, where it passes through some of the most mountainous regions in the eastern U.S., before finally hitting Asheville. Then in North Carolina, it goes through the Piedmont Triad and Raleigh-Durham before ending in Wilmington on the coast. Next up, we have our number 2 with I-80 at 2,899 miles now. This one is the closest anything will get to the number 1 spot, being within a couple hundred miles of the title. It starts in the Bay Area of California, working through the mountains and Central Valley with Sacramento, finally into Reno and the Great Basin. It works its way into Utah, crossing the Salt Flats into Salt Lake City. After that, it yet again gets very rural in the Great Plains, with Cheyenne being the only major city until Lincoln, Nebraska. From there, though, you have Omaha, Des Moines, Davenport, and Chicago, before it then goes through the bulk of the Great Lakes megaregion, with South Bend, Toledo, and Cleveland. Once it's in Pennsylvania, it has a difficult route through the Appalachians. It doesn't go through any real major cities between Cleveland and the New York metro area, where it finally ends. Finally, we have our number 1, which is I-90 at 3,021 miles. For this one, I have a full video on it where I go more extensively into the route and its history. So if you're interested, the link should be on screen right now. The roads that connect America are incredibly important to the economy. Without them, we would live in a very different place. Thanks for watching. Thank you to the members this week: Carport, Cider Schwein, Florida Jake, Philip Gertz, Somnam Woods, Big Pasty, Stormy Knight, Nikita Martinoff, KMS162, Haystack, Benjamin Whiting, Ryan Devins, Hazev the Wolf, Jake Holloway, JL, Jeremy Carport, Dominic Psyche, Rosebud 4, and Bryson. I really can't thank you guys enough. The amount you help out the channel is insane. You're genuinely just helping me as a person and helping my future. If you want to become a member, the link is in the description below, as well as next to the subscribe button. All of the money that you give to me goes straight into my college savings, so you're really just helping me as a person. I really appreciate it. It just helps me out so much. Thank you.